Okay, we're here. It is Christmas Eve, and we're having dinner with Dad. And most of the family was able to make it, but we twisted his arm a little bit to tell a couple more stories. And so this one has to do with Luther. So my Uncle Luther, and go ahead and tell the story about Luther and the train.
Okay, he and three other fellows. One was a real close friend of ours, Milford Rumsey, and then there were two Sundemeyer brothers. I don't remember their first names. I never did know them very good, but they were took off for the West Coast on a Model T Ford, and they got up into North Dakota or South Dakota, and they had 5 flat tires in one day. So they decided they'd just store the Model T and then start riding the freights and going out to the West Coast. But had an uncle lived out there that worked. He was a foreman in a big warehouse or sawmill at Kelso, Washington, real close to Oregon on the coast, and they had the river that ran right between them. Anyway, they started out on the freight in South Dakota, and the first day they were on the train, a tornado came and cut the train in half, and they were riding in the back, and there was a coal bucket that was in that car, that box car, and Milford Rumsey, when it stopped so quick, he just rolled like a ball and ended up with his head in the bucket on the end of the box car. Well, anyway, they got off the train, and the tornado had tore up the surrounding people, their farmsteads, and they're real close to one that blew the fences down, and all the cattle and everything got out. And those 4 boys, they jumped out there, and they rounded up the cattle, got them back in the corrals where they're supposed to be, and fixed the fence so that they couldn't come out again. And they went into, they invited them in to have dinner that evening, and they, I guess the railroad, they had detectives that rode the train, and they said, "You're not going to let those guys come in and have dinner." Well, they said, "Why not?" They said, "They helped us get all the livestock back in place, fix the fence." She said, "It's the least we can do." Well, okay, they thought that'd be all right. So they stayed there, and they stayed overnight. And the next day, then they took off, and they got another freight train and headed west. But that was their first experience on a train. And when they got out of ways, the trains would stop every so often, and they'd have the detectives run out and run up and down the train to kick out all the people that were riding in the boxcars. Well, when we got out in Montana, they got stopped, and everybody took off and got away from the train because they knew the detective was coming. There was one person that didn't get out quick enough, and the detective caught him, and he had a handgun. He says it was just like a big hog leg, he says. And he says that he got a hold of that guy, and he hit him in the head with that heavy gun, knocked him down, and he'd try and get up, and he'd get up to his feet, and he'd knock him down again. And they looked and they seen that, they turned, and he says, I never want to see anything like that again. He said, that, he said, was horrible. He said, that showed the evil people that were doing all the things, you know, against the people that were trying to ride and get out to where they could maybe find work. But anyway, they the train got going again, and they got on the train and took off, and they got out in the mountains, and they had tunnels, and they were going through this one tunnel, and they were riding on the top of the car because they didn't have any box cars that were open with the doors, so they had to ride on top. Well, the smoke got so thick, and they were trying to, you know, get the train fired up again so that it would get enough power to go on through the tunnel. And when they got cinders and everything, you know, that got on their blankets or whatever it was they had covering over themselves. And they had their suitcases, and they'd lay them down, and they'd go on down, and they finally got through that tunnel, and they were heading out in open country again. But it was getting cold. This was in the late fall, and the snow on the ground all over out there in the mountain areas. And they got on a flat car. They couldn't find a box car to get in, and they put their suitcases up in front of them, and just there was, I guess, a big plank or like a railroad tie that was laying on the top, and they crouched or laid down behind that, and they just laid there, and here came the detective, and he was walking down, and they were shining their lights, and they seen those four, and one of them, they could hear him talking, or the detectives, they could, Luther and the guys, they could hear them talking, and they says, oh, he says, they're froze. He said, we'll just take them into the town, and he says, we'll deal with it there.
Oh.
And so they didn't get taken off the train, off the flatbed,
They thought
because
they were
it was
frozen?
cold. It
Oh,
was
they thought
way
they were
down
frozen.
below zero.
Oh, wow.
And then they got past that, then got into town. They said it was just bitter cold, but they survived that. And then they got into town. Well, then they got into another train, and that was going the wrong way. That was heading back east. And they took off, and every time, you know, those big old steam engines, every time they'd pump, he said that speed on that train would just pick up like everything. They knew they had to get off, and they said they'd grab the side of where there was a bar that right alongside the door, and they'd grab a hold of that, and they'd just swing down and run real fast along the side of the train. Well, all three of them got off until Milford Rumsey. He was the last one, and he threw his suitcase out, and he just dove out, and he said he hit that, and the cinders and stuff along the side of or that was right by the track, and it said it just pulled his cap right down over his face, and it protected his face. But he just slid along that.
He face
And-
planted.
It was just funny to tell about that.
Oh, no.
And then they got out where they were in Oregon, and they were traveling along pretty good. And they got out to Portland, and I thought, well, that was close enough to Kelso. They stopped there, the train stopped there and they hurried and got off. Well, they got going up and the one that was in charge of the buildings and everything there, he came out, and he had the detectives grab him and bring him in the building. And he talked to him and he said, well, he says, you guys are in a lot of hot water. He said, and he was talking to him where they were planning on heading, and my brother, he said, well, he says, I have an uncle living in Kelso, Washington, and he told him where his address and his phone number, and so the one that was in the building there, he said, well, he says, just a minute, he says, just stay put. And he went into another room, and pretty soon, why, he came back out. Well, he says, you boys, he says, you go in there into the restroom, he said, and get cleaned up. He says, you're a mess. and so they did. They went in and got cleaned up, and he had called my uncle, and so then he came down from Kelso to Portland and to the railroad station and got the boys, and that one that was in charge of the place, he said, go ahead, he says, you go with him, he says, I know you've been through an awful lot, he says, but get yourself a good job and stay put. he just didn't want to have anything to do with anybody anymore,
He
so
didn't want to have to
my
deal with
uncle
them.
came in, got him, picked him up,
Vikings.
and they took off and went to Kelso, and they all got jobs out there, at least to carry them through, and my brother, he loved to fish, and he'd go down to the river, and he'd catch salmon, and his biggest one, and I had pictures of that, a 35-pound salmon, and just a beautiful, beautiful fish. And he said that was a lot of fun. He said he really enjoyed that. So they watched everything that went on out there. I guess 2 of them got into the warehouse or mill, the lumber mill, and then the others, they got other jobs wherever it was. But they got in there, got helped out, because there was no work back in this country.
About what year was
in
that?
Iowa.
About what year was that?
Huh?
What year was that? Or
That
about?
would have been in in the early 30s, I think, somewhere.
What uncle
So
I
was
know I was born in 1930, and it was after that, but I don't remember when they went,
It would have
what
been,
year.
would
It
have
was
been right in the Depression, probably.
yeah, very, oh my, yes,
it? What was
right
your
in the
uncle's
Depression
name?
time.
Shelley, that was Luther.
And there was just
It
no
was
work to be
Luther.
had
Uncle Luther.
anywhere.
It was Uncle Luther, okay.
And so they were very fortunate to get a job
Yeah.
and get in. These are things that happened back in those days that just, it's hard to imagine what was going on.
Right.